I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. It's just what America needs, another Democratic candidate for president. Reports still growing that Mayor de Blasio is poised to announce a presidential bid. Considering his low job approval poll numbers and the ethical questions about his fundraising, two questions. Is he serious, and is he kidding himself? Plus, an inside look at a stunning new book of 500 photographs from the New York Times' vast archives, the pictures of New York City paired up in ways that are sometimes funny and always clever. You'll get a sneak peek at Only in New York. But we begin with what may be turning into a serious constitutional crisis, pitting House Democrats against the Trump administration. Attorney General Barr simply did not show up at a House Judiciary Committee hearing, the president blocking special counsel Robert Mueller and former White House counsel Don McGahn from testifying before Congress. The Treasury Secretary refused to turn over Trump's tax returns to a House committee, document requests being ignored, or in the case of the unredacted Mueller report, denied by invoking executive privilege. To top it all off, the House Judiciary Committee voted to approve contempt of Congress charges against Barr for failing to turn over that unredacted Mueller report. Can the White House justify defying Congress by stonewalling, stalling, and suing? Where's all this heading? Eleanor Randolph, contributing writer for the New York Times, and Dr. Heath Brown, a professor at City University. What constitutes contempt of Congress? Nancy Pelosi is saying this is indeed a constitutional crisis. Where are we in the scheme of things?
You know, if this is a crisis, we've been in a crisis for a long time. These kinds of claims have a fairly long history. And so it seems like this is a point at which this is pretty regular course for Congress. Members of the Bush administration, members of the Clinton administration face similar kinds of accusations and similar kinds of claims. And so in some ways, the crisis that's being claimed in Congress is one that's just sort of par for the course now in D.C.
You know, the whole idea of presidential privilege just It clearly he is overusing it and stretching it beyond its means at this point. And I don't see how he can tell Robert Mueller not to testify. I mean, first of all, he has a right to speak out if he wants to. But secondly, this is not what that privilege is about. That privilege is about talking to your staff, or it's about dealing with CIA issues or other things like that. It's not about the Mueller report. So it seems to me there are ways around this blockade that the Trump administration has come up with, plus the fact that Congress has plenty of power on its own. It has the power of the purse, for example. Our forefathers built this system that gives everybody some power to counteract the president or the courts. I mean, you can see it all at work. I would think this would be a great time to be teaching government because you've got so many interesting players in so many different spots.
There are a lot of things at play here and seem to contradict each other. We also, of course, have freedom of speech in this country.
Right.
What if Mueller just went before Congress and talked? Does he work for Attorney General Barr or the White House? How much control legally, technically, politically do they really have over him?
You know, I don't think we know exactly. I mean, these are all based on the institutional practices that some of them go back centuries. Whether Mueller would come forward and sort of defy the will of the president is a possibility. The question, I think, in so many cases now is, will our institutions bend and then break? And what you're talking about there is the institution sort of breaking in a way for a member of the Department of Justice to sort of defy the president in this way would be an institution breaking. It may be a good time for that to happen, but it would be a real departure from what we've come to expect of these situations in the past.
And where does that compare with the Nixon impeachment in terms of separation of powers and defying Congress in withholding information?
I would say we don't even have to kind of go back that far. In the 1990s, Janet Reno was charged with similar kinds of contempt for not sharing documents with Congress. She ultimately didn't, but those documents came forward during the impeachment hearings of President Clinton. So there are precedents for this, and we don't even have to go back to the Nixon era. We can just go back to the Clinton era and see similar kinds of things happening.
You know, I don't think the contempt citation is going to mean very much. You can't put Barr in jail. You can't, I mean, that's probably not going to happen. I also have some faith that there are ways around this headbutting that we've got in Washington right now. I mean, what you're seeing in, for example, Albany, they are sort of setting up a situation on the Trump tax returns so that, you know, when you file your tax returns in New York State, it's the same thing that you file to Washington. And if Congress wants to, Albany and the legislature is saying, okay, if you want Trump's tax returns, you can get them here. You can get them from New York State. So they're very, to me, people are looking at more inventive ways of sort of getting around the craziness that's going on.
Even the Wall Street Journal is calling on Trump to release his tax returns. We've run stories in the Times about earlier returns, talking about enormous losses, which Trump has been trying to spin into saying, well, he's a good businessman. I'm not sure, I don't know enough about finances to understand how that works. But doesn't it suggest that there's something to hide?
I think there's a good possibility of that, but I think that what you said at the beginning is absolutely right, that a lot of this is spin. I think what we know from public opinion is that the way in which the Attorney General handled the Mueller report is widely unpopular. And as long as the conversation focuses on that, the president is in trouble. If the conversation can be shifted to a battle between Republicans and Democrats trying to grab things from the White House, I think that puts the president on good standing. I think it's one of the reasons why they're trying to shift the conversation in that direction, even if all of these claims of contempt are really going to go nowhere. Ultimately, they help the president's cause in the sort of the area of public opinion.
And of course, if the economy keeps humming along, none of this may matter at all. Thanks to Eleanor Randolph of the New York Times, Heath Brown of City University. Coming up straight ahead, New Yorkers don't seem to think much of the job Mayor de Blasio is doing. Does he really believe the folks in Iowa, South Carolina, and other states will back him for president? We'll talk about that next. An April poll by Quinnipiac found that Mayor de Blasio has an anemic 42% job approval rating. In the same poll, 76% of New York City voters said he should not run for president. Only 18% said he should. But indications were that he was gearing up for a run. This despite a New York Times editorial entitled, "De Blasio may want to be president. What do his donors want?" The editorial said, in part, the ease with which the mayor continues to accept donations from people seeking business before the city is disquieting, even if the fundraising breaks no laws. So is the mayor in political fantasy land? Jeffrey Mays, a Metro political reporter for the Times, David Goodman, a Metro reporter. What has the mayor got to lose by running?
Well, I think, asked me that question 2 weeks ago, I would have said not very much. I think there was this impression within his camp and a lot of other folks sort of observing this, that he really, he was kind of bored by governing the city, and that he was energized by being out there and the attention that he was getting from various promises he was making. But more recently, as he's floated this idea of running for president more concretely, and people have started to look at it more seriously, and the fundraising stuff has come up again, he was more or less laughed sort of off the internet when it leaked last week that, or it was reported last week that he was going to be announcing this week. It turns out he put that off or wasn't going to do it. But in any case, there was a sobering moment where he was received with sort of mockery rather than jubilation in Democratic circles. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is what happens if he decides to dip his toe into the waters, does very poorly, and has to come back home and finish out his term. You know, there are already several candidates who want to be mayor. That's gonna, you know, they're going to be aggressive and they're going to move against the mayor. They're going to try to make his policy decisions even more difficult than they have been. So there is a little risk if he decides to actually run.
But his approval rating in the city is fairly low anyway. He's a lame duck anyway because of term limits. He can claim he's going out to raise the city's profile, raise urban issues that chances certainly are not going to be raised by any of the other candidates. So even though he's, to say the least, a long shot, can't he claim this is, you know, for more better than worse?
I think there was a case to be made to that effect, that if he was out there being taken seriously on the national stage, then that would cause folks back home to have to take him more seriously than he was being taken at this point. He wouldn't have seemed like such a lame duck. He would have been seeming like someone, you know, with great sort of, where the stars were aligning and he had great promise in the future. But if he's out there and no one's listening to him, he seems to be ignored, then that emboldens, I think, the people that back home are already kind of looking for his job and looking to get some advantage from this government that seems a little bit sort of rudderless right now.
I mean, that's been his argument, is that a lot of the progressive issues that people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are talking about, he's already done in New York City. He's already done universal pre-K. He has a sort of health care proposal that's kind of questionable as to whether it actually guarantees health care for everyone or not. But his argument is that he's this progressive executive, that he's done some of the progressive issues that candidates are talking about, and he has that executive experience that will give him an advantage in the White House. And, you know, if you think back to when he was first elected and you look at the clips, as I was doing the other day, you know, he was viewed as the tip of this progressive spear, and, you know, these great things were changing and happening. And, you know, 5 years later, that's changed a bit.
I mean, the mayor really made a mistake, I think, 4 years ago in 2015 when he tried to take some of that good press that he had right off the bat and really launch himself nationally before he established what he could do in the city. And I think, you know, people will dispute the legacy that he's left in his first term, but I think that had he really sort of put his nose down and worked hard in New York City and had the record that he has of creating pre-K, of basically keeping the city calm, getting some you know, progressive things done here, he could have then made a case to run for president now. But I think he's had so many sort of failed attempts to get on the national stage that this just seems like, oh, there goes Bill de Blasio again, trying for more prominence.
So if we stipulate that that record is a record that he could run on, what about the baggage? How serious, how weighty is that baggage that he would bring to a race, or that he's got to lug around with him now even as mayor?
I mean, you can make the argument, I can see how his people are at least making the argument, is that the attention that he gets in New York City from the very aggressive, very detailed New York press corps is not going to be the same attention that he's going to get in Iowa, New Hampshire, you know, South Carolina, when he brings his biracial family there, his wife and his children. You know, you can make the argument that people are going to look at the things that he's done. And that's the argument that they're making, is that, you know, it's just a hyper media environment in New York City, and his failures get blown out of proportion here.
The trouble for the mayor, though, and I was talking to one of his advisors about this, is that you know, he really doesn't make moments that you need, the kinds of moments that you need to make on a campaign trail. And he hasn't done that as mayor, and he's never really shown an ability as a campaigner to sort of have these crystallizing moments that tell you who he is, what he's about. He tries, and he tries to have organic sort of things that would sort of galvanize attention and supporters behind him, but it's not very natural for him. He's not really a natural politician. So even though he appears good on paper, I think, you know, he would really run a very good campaign for someone else. He's always more been a strategist than you know, comfortable in the role as being the candidate. And I think that nowhere is that more obvious than on the national stage. More than that, I think he used to be a progressive lion, and he's been a little bit eclipsed by some more charismatic, more progressive figures, not just Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, but you have AOC now. You have a lot of people that make him seem more of a centrist figure.
Well, in part because, unlike them, he's had to govern, which makes it a lot harder to be progressive. In terms of the baggage, though, how substantive are the problems he faces in terms of ethics, in terms of fundraising? People have raised questions. How serious are the answers?
They're the kinds of questions that got raised about Hillary Clinton, I think, and he would face those same sorts of questions. And he certainly, as various entities have observed, went very close to the legal limit of what was available to do in terms of raising money off of people that had business before the city. But more than the fundraising, I mean, I think visitors to New York and people that ride the subways know that, there are failures in this city under his watch. Homelessness is still an endemic problem. The subways are not working the way they should.
But homelessness is not much worse than it was under the prior mayor. Subways, Andrew Cuomo has already claimed are his.
Well, so homelessness is worse than it was under the previous mayor, and he's promised to essentially not do anything to bring it down. I mean, you can't blame him for that, but I just think he's got a lot of problems to deal with right here at home that would make it hard to really run on a platform that says, I did the most for the people that have the least. Look at public housing. I mean, this is a massive scandal under his watch.
And then I left town.
Right.
Thanks to Jeff Mays, David Goodman of the New York Times. Coming up next, the New York Times has hundreds of thousands of photos in our archives. We'll show you some of the best. Add a new book, Only in New York. New York Times photographers have been taking pictures since the earliest days of the camera. They've not only captured the biggest news stories, but also quirky, intimate, and unusual images of life in New York. 500 of the very best are paired up in a beautiful new book entitled Only in New York. Darcy Everly is the editor, and she joins us now. People say that, have said that New York Times is really about words, not pictures. This book certainly belies that. How did you pick out the 500 pictures from hundreds of thousands that are in our archives?
If not millions, Sam. We actually set off to find images that were quirky and compelling and told a story of New York that might surprise both a native New Yorker or a tourist picking up the book for the first time, and just really trying to set a picture of how different our city is, how diverse our city is, how exciting our city is at every moment, and even to catch little bits and pieces of very simple things that you might pass by on the street every day and not notice until it's actually captured in time.
Did you have any favorites?
Oh, I have several favorites. I think you're going to show a lot of them today. But yes, I do. I think the point of doing this book was really to try and show a variety of images. And there are quiet moments where you see piles of dirty snow in New York and you think, oh, how disgusting. But when you see it captured and paired with a very funny shot of somebody selling those dirty snowballs for money, you have a whole new perspective on what you're looking at.
What kind of pool of photographs did you have to choose from? How far back did it go? Did we save all the photographs we took with these negatives, prints?
I worked with a combination of negatives, prints, and images from the digital collection, and I looked at the entirety of the New York Times collection from as early as the late 1800s up until the moment we published the book.
And is there something missing in that collection, or did it encompass just about everything?
Oh, well, with the millions of photos, I've gotten it down to 500, and I'm sure we've left quite a bit out, but I think that, I think we tried to really hit all corners of New York City. I think we tried to hit all members of the staff. I tried to hit different types of moments you would see in New York City, the tourist sites, the restaurants, the action, the workers, the people, the everyday, ordinary people who live here.
And we've certainly had great photographers on our staff.
Absolutely the best.
Yeah.
And that's what made this book so easy to put together. I mean, we had such an incredible pool of imagery that was all so good and so fun and funny. The hard part was actually in the paring it down, and finding just those 500.
I'll bet. 500 sounds like a lot, but now consider what you had to choose from. People in New York talk about a New York exceptionalism, but when you went through these pictures, could they have been taken any place, or were they only in New York?
Oh, they were definitely only in New York. I don't think any place else you're going to see guests of the Met Gala compared to characters in Times Square.
Oh, what is the difference between pictures like this and images that we see on the web now, whether they're still images or now as we go more and more to video? Is there a difference the way people absorb them, the way people react to them, do you think?
Well, I think when they're in a book, I think you have the time to sit and really pay attention, to spend some time looking at the photos, trying to decide what the content of the photo is. I think often when you're just viewing things on the web or you're viewing videos on the web, time goes by you so quickly that you don't stop to really take that moment and savor the photographs and see the little details. I hope that readers of this book look in there and look at all corners of those photos and see the things in the background, see the things that you might miss otherwise.
And when they read this book, what do you want them to walk away with? I don't think they'll sit and read it all at once, but if they do, they'll look at these 500 photographs. What do you want them to think?
When I did it, I want them to think how I saw it. I imagined when I found a photograph and found a pairing that would work together, I imagined that my eyes were closed. I'd open up in a time and place. I'd see a moment. I'd close my eyes and be transported someplace different, someplace completely different in New York City in another time. And when I'd open up my eyes, I see something familiar. There's a comparison. The pictures need to work together.
The book is only in New York, and thanks to Darcy Everly, and I'll add my thoughts on CODA coming up next. The last time Bill de Blasio dithered about a presidential candidacy, it was 2016. Should he endorse Hillary Clinton? Of course he would eventually, because she was going to win the nomination. But by that time, she didn't much need or care about his support. And by playing hard to get, he managed to alienate not only Clinton's followers, but also fans of Bernie Sanders, with whom he had briefly flirted. This time he's been mulling whether to run himself. White House fever is an occupational hazard for New York mayors. Ask Rudy Giuliani or John Lindsay, who led a brief quixotic campaign to awaken Washington to the plight of urban America. Neither Lindsay nor Giuliani won a single convention delegate. Giuliani got 340,000 votes in 6 states, or less than the number of New Yorkers, just from Brooklyn and Staten Island, who voted for him when he barely won as mayor in 1993. The fact is, no New York City mayor has ever made it to the White House. No former mayor from any city has been elected president since Grover Cleveland of Buffalo in 1884 and Calvin Coolidge of Northampton, Massachusetts in 1924. Still, stranger things have happened recently in presidential politics. And statistically, while New York voters have counted less and less, New York candidates have made a comeback. Separate analyses by the 538 blog and City and State have found 2 factoids. The most common state for presidential nominees has been New York. Depending on your definition, a New Yorker has been the Democratic nominee 15 times. A Republican 10 times. That's 25 altogether. Illinois was a distant second with 9. In 2016, both major parties' nominees were New Yorkers, breaking a streak without one That went back to Richard Nixon in 1972. Of the last two who were actually born in the state and won, the results for New York were mixed. FDR helped save the city with the New Deal. Trump cut some taxes, but more importantly, slashed state and local tax deductions. Also, of the nearly 24 candidates now, nearly a third have some New York connection. Trump, of course, Senator Gillibrand, Bernie Sanders, who was raised in Brooklyn, the entrepreneurs Howard Schultz and Andrew Yang, William Weld, who was born on Long Island, California transplant and perennial Green Party candidate Howie Hawkins, to say nothing of de Blasio. He would begin already encumbered by lingering ethical questions about his campaign fundraising and by another statistic that bodes badly. Of all the candidates mentioned, he was the only one whom people viewed more unfavorably than favorably. But what do you expect of a New Yorker who still roots for the Red Sox? For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.